Thank you to the Dean, thank you to Paul, and thank you all for coming and for the invitation. It's a great privilege to be able to talk to you about film, especially since it coincides with the presence of so many people also interested in film and philosophy. I'm very grateful to be here, and I thank you for all your hospitality. I show a lot of clips, and I let my film colleagues tell me, run on too long. I'm always being criticized by them. But I just can't bear to show 10 or 15 seconds. So I'll go almost a full hour, and I hope we have a lot of time for discussion. Let us assume, at least for the sake of argument, that films, realist narrative films at least, can be understood as speech acts. Now, I don't mean anything very controversial about that. I just mean the distinction between what someone meant and what they meant by saying it. The acts are narrations of a story addressed to an audience, and we can ask what the director or the collective intelligence we can postulate behind the making of the film meant by so narrating a story. Sometimes, many times, of course, the answer will be he or she or they meant only to be narrating the story, because the story is in itself entertaining, thrilling, hilarious. But some films can be said to attempt to illuminate something that would otherwise remain poorly understood. The point or purpose of such narrating is such an illumination. And one way of rendering intelligible or illuminating is to show that what we might have thought unproblematic or simple common sense is not at all straightforward and is much harder to understand than we often take for granted. Coming to see that something is not as intelligible as we had thought can also be illuminating. That is especially true of the films I would like to discuss. To date, from 1996 until the present, the Belgian team of Luc and Jean-Pierre Dardenne have made 7 theatrical fictional films for which they are willing to claim authorship. There are other fiction films by them, Falche in 1987, the short film Il court que le monde in 1988, and in 1992, Je pense à vous. But they have in one way or another distanced themselves from these, and in the case of the last, they have disowned it, furious at studio interference with the final cut. A new film, Du jour une nuit, was recently released to everywhere but the United States, I'm embarrassed to say, was recently released to enthusiastic reviews. All the films revolve around a basic moral question, usually having to do with responsibility, and all manifest a heightened sense of the complexity of the moral psychology necessary to understand our characters dealing with the question. Part of that complexity has to do with the fact that our attention is constantly drawn to the connections between the psychological turmoil, stress, and confusion they are experiencing and the distinctive characteristics of the social world in which the characters live. That link between the psychological and the social, or the demonstration of the inseparability between the moral economy of the soul and social relations of power and powerlessness, is one of the great achievements of their films, as I'll try to show. I'll argue that various cinematic properties of their films involve a way of rethinking basic issues in our conventional understanding of the inner-outer relationship in ordinary action. This, of course, involves a very large issue. What is it to call these aesthetic objects ways of rethinking? But in this context, especially with this audience, I don't have to go too far into that, and I'll limit myself to selected details. With respect to that issue, it would not be unfair or anachronistic to say that in each case, the Dardenne brothers are clearly trying to represent the motivation and decisions of certain characters, but that they proceed under 2 unmistakable assumptions. That there is often something very difficult to understand, even mysterious, about such motivations, decisions, and reactions by others, and that the social context within which these decisions must be made is now novel, a product of free trade zones, migrant labor, the common market, and globalized finance capitalism, all creating a new context historically for labor and power, the implications of which are not yet fully clear to any of us. They are obviously quite self-conscious about what it is to represent such issues in film, and are clearly doing all they can to block or interrupt or prevent conventional assumptions and their counterpart in cinematic technique from coming into play. Moreover, as just noted, they often, although not always, have in mind characters who are victims of the new globalized finance capitalism world economy. For one thing, this is a world where a ruthless form of competitiveness is forced on workers, where one person's job is another person's unemployment, and the two often know each other. Or for another, some characters are migrants in a strange land, so they live so far outside the normal cycle of production and consumption that in some way their own relationship to their inner lives, their own self-understanding, cannot be understood in ways typical for those who live inside the social world that they live outside of. They have no acknowledged social status whatsoever. And this has a psychological, not just a social dimension. This fact is especially important because the acts in question can seem gratuitous and unmotivated, and in that sense, very hard to understand. A boy under no pressure and clearly on the verge of escaping undetected suddenly confesses to the wife of a man whose death he helped to cover up. The Promise, 1996. A girl rendered almost insane by her inability to find work, already a great example of the theme just introduced. Unemployment itself can be a form of what could be called objective insanity. Having informed on a friend to secure a job, suddenly resigns the position. Rosetta, 1999. A man decides to take on as an apprentice and help teach a boy who, he knows, murdered his own son 5 years earlier, and on the verge of vengeance, releases the boy and works with him. The Sun, 2002. A street criminal casually, thoughtlessly sells his just-born baby for adoption. But when he sees the overwhelming effect of this on the child's mother, his girlfriend, immediately retrieves the baby at enormous cost to himself and his future. The Child, 2005. An immigrant woman from Albania, having secured her own legal residence in Belgium, is involved in a plot to live with an addict until he overdoses, so that she can then, for money, marry and then divorce a Russian eager to emigrate and also gain Belgian citizenship. But she begins to help the addict get off drugs, ruining the plan, and in the face of terrifying threats of reprisal, continues to refuse to go along with the plan even after the addict is murdered by her accomplices. The Silence of Lorna, 2008. A woman who by mere chance happens to be just once in the same place as a troubled boy searching for the derelict father who's abandoned him, suddenly involves herself deeply in the boy's life, ruining her own romantic relationship and assuming responsibilities no one would say she owed anyone. The Kid with the Bike, 2011. Of course, these are films, not treatises, and so whatever they render intelligible is rendered cinematically intelligible. And what that amounts to is a topic worthy of several books. In other words, simply said, films can be said to show us things beyond the narrative facts, things that involve the point of such depiction or narration in that way, but this not in the way of a discursive account or in the way of arguments, evidence, consideration of counter-evidence, not in the way of propositional knowledge. That distinct way must be some sort of primarily sensible affective modality of rendering intelligible, a matter of how we are moved, how some features of a moral landscape become more salient, how some features grip us, excite our imagination, how we are surprised or puzzled by events we come to see in some new way because we are so surprised or puzzled. What the brothers have accomplished is all the more remarkable because the principal characters are not well educated or articulate or reflective. Almost everything about what is traditionally thought of as their psychology must be represented purely cinematically, through what they do and in their faces, as in a silent film. In sum, I want to claim that the Dardenne brothers' films are made in the light of a clear self-consciousness about the possible visual and dramatic intelligibility of our moral lives, and that this self-consciousness results in cinematic representations, the powerful credibility of which begin to challenge philosophical and even common sense orthodoxy about our explanations of human action. It's first necessary to say something about the career of the brothers and their relation to other filmmakers. They began as documentary filmmakers, and their approach was from the start decidedly political. They focused on the Belgian labor movement, especially in the grim industrial area of Serang, and gradually moved from making what might be called activist films aimed at consciousness raising to more historical work, in effect conceding what is now all too obvious, that the labor movement after World War II decisively lost its great battle with the owners of capital. In fact, it would not be an exaggeration to say that the Dardenne films are the most self-conscious artistic explorations we have of the quotidian and lived-through consequences of the global absence of any organized, principled resistance to the excesses of capitalism after the collapse in the 70s and the 80s of any credible form of international leftist solidarity. The task now was to try to understand what happened and to document the enormity of what was thereby lost. Most of all, what was lost was an experience of solidarity and social unity, at least the sort that is possible in a collective struggle or in genuinely cooperative work. So in all the feature films, we see exclusively working-class characters, small shop owners, laborers, garage mechanics, carpenters, beauticians, dry cleaners, as well as petty criminals, human smugglers, minor racketeers. What we don't see is also important. There is not only nothing in the way of class or politically inspired solidarity, there's very little in the way of local community or collective life. No circle of friends for anyone, no neighborhood solidarity. Families are horribly fractured. Parents are grotesquely irresponsible in The Promise, Rosetta, The Child, and The Kid with the Bike, and the dire consequences for the children is a major theme. Luc Dardenne has even said that we live in the age of Chronos, with fathers devouring their children. Mostly, we sense that each person is radically on his or her own, and in that profound zero-sum competition with each other mentioned earlier, sometimes called American capitalism with great justification, such that this feature of life must influence how we try to understand what they do. Normalcy itself, even psychological normalcy or some fantasy of normalcy, becomes the highest aspiration for some characters. It has even been said that the brothers are depicting the situation of ethics in the ruin of politics, or are showing us a post-social realism. And it's true that in the absence of anything recognizably political, the epiphanic moral moments that characterize each film occur in moments of deep, unexpected intimacy, seem inspired by the sheer physical presence of some one particular other person, and that these moments of moral acknowledgement do not descend from any principles held, are ad hoc, and are unconnected to any group or class or even neighborhood consciousness. The wrongs depicted are injustices, wrongs always against someone, but the wrongs and the recovery from them, and remorse, forgiveness, or reconciliation are always intimately personal. The structural features of the social world within which these wrongs are all too likely to occur are not absent, but these tend to be treated fatalistically, or at least not as possible objects of collective redress. This is not to say that the feature films are simply grim, merely cataloging the catastrophe. As already noted, there are stirring moments of resistance, even transcendence in each film, however individualized and isolated. These moments are achievements of a distinct sort, forged inevitably in acts directed against the attempted suppression or marginalization of any robust assertions of their agency. Each of the moments noted above can seem gratuitous and inexplicable in a way, but remarkably not in a way that is unsatisfying or frustrating, as in a case like that of a hardened criminal in a film who suddenly recants and becomes saintly. We are somehow prepared for such reversals, and understanding that somehow and the right comprehension of the status of such moments seem to be the questions of each and every film. Second, the influences on the brothers are also clear. There are philosophical influences, at least on Luc Dardenne, who has written a philosophy book, Sur l'affaire humaine, as well as a kind of journal, philosophical journal, about the making of 3 of their films, Au dos de nos images, a title that must be referring to an unusual filming technique used by the brothers, which we'll discuss soon. They have also given many revealing interviews. The most frequent names mentioned in the book and interviews are Nietzsche, Heidegger, Levinas, a figure who looms large in what critical commentary there is about the brothers, Kafka, and Freud. The cinematic influences are obvious. For Rosetta, and indeed for the tonality and pace of many of their films, Robert-Bresson, especially Mouchette and Au hasard Balthazar. They are especially influenced by Bresson's resistance to what Bresson called psychological acting, as we'll see below. For the general mise-en-scène in the depiction of Seraing, Rossellini's Germany, Year Zero, and neorealism in general are of obvious importance. In the treatment of adolescence, a frequent theme, Truffaut's 400 Blows. In The Kid with the Bike, obviously De Sica and Bicycle Thieves. They have also singled out Kurosawa's Stray Dog and Mitogushi's Street of Shame. So much for background. I turn now to my main theme, which could be summarized as the problem in general of the cinematic representation of the relation between determinate forms of mindedness and outer bodily movements and other forms of expression, in the exercise of agency, and the specific inflection of that relation in the particular world that serves as the new context or the horizon for the intelligible doings of the characters. Insofar as we can speak of an issue being raised in a film, this issue is raised most prominently by several striking cinematic techniques. I'll mention 4, and then try to assess the philosophical implications of such an aesthetics. First, the cuts in the film and the selection of detail by the camera do not seem to match what we would conventionally expect to be the natural beginnings and endings of some action or conversation. And that focus, cinematic focus, does not seem to isolate what we would normally consider the salient visual details given the action. People do not enter and exit scenes according to normal convention, and the scenes do not begin and end in a way that corresponds to the beginning and ending of actions or even conversations. This in itself already implicitly interrogates what really is a beginning and an end for an action, or what counts as the unity of some one action. There are many jump cuts. Someone's walking somewhere and we begin to follow with the camera, but suddenly there's a jump cut to the destination and we experience a kind of gap. Have we missed something, or is what we did not see not really a part of what was being done, and what counts as a part of what is done? The unconventional framing of scenes does not help us foreground what is of major and what is of minor significance. This too already suggests that conventional views on what a discrete action is and what the unity of an action consists in, what is and is not relevant to its explanation, and so how it could be represented, are not in force. We do not watch a determinate action unfold as such in front of us as much as hurry along beside the characters, as unclear about what is happening and why as they often are. The films themselves all begin and end abruptly, going straight from or to a black screen. In The Sun, the scene that opens the film, which we'll see soon, a conversation between Olivier and an administrator had already begun before the film, before we arrive, as it were, in the midst of an activity of hammering and sawing that's also going on, and that we hear before the film itself even begins visually. We might also say that Olivier's state of mind is represented on the soundtrack, as we hear the irritating high whine of a piece of equipment, a high-pitched oral sign of Olivier's extreme discomfort immediately visible in the scene. What we will learn is that Olivier, a dedicated teacher at a kind of trade reform school for youthful offenders, has been asked to take on a boy, Francis, as another apprentice. We also learn later that he recognizes the name immediately as that of the boy who murdered his son, and declines. We see him, we learn later, somehow in the process of changing his mind and accepting Francis, a rather long process. It takes up the first 20 minutes of the film, and the change is occasioned by nothing dramatic or decisive. But he does not seem to be weighing the pros and cons or reflecting on his motives. He looks mostly stunned, anxious, and very confused. The ultimate decision to accept Francis seems at least occasioned by a visit from his ex-wife, who comes to tell him that she is getting remarried and is pregnant. Her understandable view in the face of their trauma is to escape the past and begin anew, something we sense Olivier both cannot and will not do. And it is shortly thereafter that he simply accepts Francis as an apprentice. Throughout this process, Olivier seems to have no fixed or determinate idea about what he should do, or even about how to think about what he should do. He's almost frantically uncertain, and once he accepts Francis, it's fair to say that he still has no fixed, or at least accessible to him, idea why he did. And early in the film, we know none of this, and so are even more in the dark, and we have to imagine for quite a while what might be causing the obvious discomfort in Olivier. Later, when we know who Francis is, we might think that Olivier is planning some sort of revenge, and that gives the film a great tension on the first viewing. The film is built for the viewer around two sorts of tension: tension about what had happened, and then tension about what will happen. What, if anything, is Olivier planning? It takes us a while to appreciate the complete irrelevance of the notion of planning. Without many establishing shots setting out where we are, and with so little in the way of exposition, with no reflective characters discussing what is happening, and with so many jump cuts and so many small narrative gaps, where we are and what Olivier is up to can be very hard to establish. Like Bresson and Ozu, particularly Bresson, the movie doesn't rely very much at all on dialogue. Everything is the movement of the characters, the expressions on their faces, and the composition and change of scenes. Especially in The Sun, the camera, in following Olivier, seems to be literally following him like a person, staying out of his sight, and as you'll see in this clip, peering around a corner, which we see in the frame, unobserved, pursuing him, as if embodying our desire not to miss anything, and so perhaps to understand. The action does not seem as filmed from outside looking in, but from within the scene of the action, as if a truly external point of view were a comforting delusion. Here is 40 seconds or so that will indicate how unusual the angles, camera placements, and jump cuts are. Olivier's slightly paranoid look at the very end is also striking. So could I have my clips, please? Thank you.
Je peux manger ici?
Oui. T'as pas de place?
Il y a trop de bruit.
When the film begins, we are also, as in this scene, very close up to Olivier, but behind him, an unusual, almost bizarre close-up angle, one that makes it difficult to establish the center of whatever the action is. Olivier's anxious pondering in the clip I will show next is not continuous. It's interrupted by a problem in the woodworking area. A plank has become stuck, and Olivier must release it, an image of blockage and release, not unrelated to what has happened and what will happen to Olivier. The camera, as you'll see in a non-diegetic turn, shows us his back brace, although no one's talking about it, another sign of the constriction he has had to live under, as well as a visible sign of the assistance he needs to bear up under the load he's carrying. And as you'll see, there's again a jump cut as he rushes somewhere down the stairs. So, yeah.
Olivier! Olivier, viens vite!
Vous n'avez rien à faire là, retournez à votre place. Vous avez dit de les passer 2 fois 2 mm. On lâche le frein. On descend. 2 fois. Non, je peux pas. Déjà avec 4, je m'en sors pas.
Bon, ben, je vais voir s'il reste une place en soudure.
That phrase, 2 fois, 2 times, that will be nothing in their films is incidental. That will be very, very important at the end of the film, as we'll see. These questions, when can an action properly be said to begin, and when end, as well as what is part of the action, what not, and why, are not altogether representable visually. Let me say as an aside, in this case, just to give an example, the question of when the decision to accept Francis as an apprentice begins is complicated by the fact that Olivier, we learn later, had been in business with his brother at the lumberyard that is the scene at the end of the film. But after the murder of his son, he quit. And of all the places where he could have worked, he began to work at a reform school for youthful offenders. So when the action of encountering, he must have known that when Francis was released, there was some possibility that he would come through the school. So when the action of dealing with Francis began is obviously in the air. Are not all representable visually. They depend on the right act description and the agent's self-understanding, and for that we need some dialogue. But there is already something destabilizing, or at least interrogative, in these unnatural cinematic suggestions about action unity. By destabilizing and interrogative, I mean at this point only that the quite plausible understanding of the form of an action, and hence its unity, the account that comes down to us from Aristotle, that actions are undertaken for the sake of some end, properly begin when we undertake something in order to achieve that end, the parts or elements of which must be related to that end within this in order to structure, so that smoking a cigarette when one is building a house is not part of the house building activity, and are over either when the end is achieved or we give up, does not fit what Olivier is doing when he accepts Francis. For one thing, such dependence on the agent's self-understanding assumes the possibility of some sort of transparency to the self, to itself, at least with regards to one's own purposes. And although that's almost always unproblematic, that too, we're being signaled, will be in question. And not in the name of that's what's so interesting about this film, not in the name of the unconscious or a lack of self-knowledge in principle possible. What is quite credibly shown in the non-standard representations of the mindedness of many of these characters, especially with Olivier, is that there's nothing yet to be known, or at least nothing determinate about what end he seeks in accepting Francis, even though he is certainly acting. Things are not merely happening to him. Besides this very frequent lack of fit between the cinematic composition of scenes and the conventional unity of actions, we have seen something of the second technique in noting the very close-up position of the camera behind the character. This manner of filming is probably the most prominent and distinctive in all the films, the position of the handheld and so documentary-style camera in relation to the characters being filmed. The most dramatic use of the technique was on display right away at the beginning of their first two serious feature films, The Promise and Rosetta. In the beginning of the latter, which I'll show, Rosanna has been fired, not because she is not a good worker, despite the unavoidable tardiness caused by the bus system. We learn that she is a scrupulously, even ferociously good worker. Having and keeping a normal job means everything to her. But her training period has ended, and we assume her employer must pay her considerably more if he keeps her. It's easier for him just to continue to cycle through such temporaries. The incredibly intense actress is Émilie Dequesne, who had never acted before but won the Best Actress prize at Cannes that year. It's also very interesting that as she storms toward a confrontation about her dismissal, Rosetta 3 times closes the door on the unstable pursuing camera, on us. However close we think we are allowed to get to the character, we are reminded that something is always blocked off. The gaps in the editing suggest the same thing. Something important is very often always missing. Hence the appropriateness of the title of Luc's book, Au-dos de nos images. They film from behind the character. We see a great many backs and backs of heads in their films, very close, and especially, as noted earlier, as if pursuing the character, hastening after them, trying to catch up, following them somewhat anxiously, as if trying to follow the plot. Here's the extraordinarily intense beginning of Rosetta.
Revenez dans mon bureau. Revenez dans mon bureau, je vous dis.
C'est vrai que t'as dit que j'étais souvent en retard?
Peu importe, c'est pas le problème.
Tu l'as dit ou pas?
J'ai signalé tes 2 retards, j'ai dit que c'était à cause du bus,
Ça n'a aucune importance, Madame Brigade. Laissez, vous revenez dans mon bureau.
Pourquoi vous avez dit qu'elle l'avait dit?
Peu importe, ce n'est pas la raison par laquelle vous avez été remercié.
Je fais bien mon travail ou pas?
Oui.
Alors pourquoi est-ce que vous voulez que je parte?
Je vous l'ai dit, vous avez été remercié parce que vous avez terminé votre période d'essai.
Pourquoi pas alors que je fais bien mon travail?
Parce que vous êtes la seule à avoir terminé votre période d'essai. Allez vous changer, revenez dans mon bureau.
Non.
In all their films, our first impression is always of being much too close to the character, and this also has something to do with the psychology of deliberation and action. We do not seem to have sufficient distance to assess what's going on, and since we are following on so close to the character, we sense that in their experience too, they are propelled forward in the action in a way that can't be said to be guided by reflection in the standard stepwise way. They are, in effect, too close to their own action as well, without sufficient distance. By being so often behind the characters, we can never also have their point of view. We're being reminded that we cannot see what they see, that any potential understanding is limited, even more limited than theirs. And the pace of the action is such that isolating moments of inner reflection and subsequent outer manifestation is very difficult. Third, as we've been seeing, the brothers make use extensively of one of the most potent cinematic techniques ever invented, the close-up. It is the cinema's version of the famous Wittgenstein maxim from the Philosophical Investigations, the human body is the best picture of the human soul. In the films with the most close-ups, like The Sun or The Silence of Lorna, we sense, I want to suggest, fully aware that this is the most tentative of the suggestions I'm making, something different from the treatment of the face as a sign or mark of the interior, but that paradoxically some attitude or reaction is first of all realized in or inseparable from such a physical dimension, or at least that the putative isolation of the psychological as an ex ante determinate inner world, which could be expressed or not, which we see by looking at and into a face, is being challenged by an attempt to locate such a putative interiority instead in the world. We see any such inner world taking shape and changing in the activities and expressions of the characters, and in some cases we see that there's very little going on in such a putative world beforehand. As we'll discuss soon, we see any such putative inner psychology as almost at degree 0. This is all challenging and difficult enough, but there is another huge difference in their use of close-ups when compared to the conventions. In the cinematic world of the Dardenne brothers, when we get something more of the character than the full back and the back of the head, we rarely get more than half or very occasionally 3/4 of the face. And they are fond of shooting such unusual close-ups from the rear of an automobile, accentuating again the theme of speed, forward motion always underway, without much in the way of punctuated moments of reflection or decision, as well as a way of agents putting us almost claustrophobically in the scene. Throughout all the films, however, what we expect from the close-up is frustrated. We expect some revelation, a mark of some passion or intensity or guilt, but in their films we can't get the best picture of the soul, the front of the face, in view. It is as if, even taking account of how little pure interiority is sometimes suggested in their close-ups, what partial insight we might gain about the character's mindedness is deliberately denied us, as if we're being told that we will have to make do with some very partial picture of the soul. Their dominant close-up, again, is the profile. This is remarkable, given what the close-up is famously able to do. Consider, for the sake of contrast, Carl Dreyer's famous use of Maria Falconetti in Joan of Arc, 1928. I'm also convinced, but obviously can't prove, that the Dardennes are thinking of Falconetti in the way they cut the hair and photograph and to some extent heroize the Albanian actress Arta Dobroshi in The Silence of Lorna. There are other contrasts in these two scenes I want to show as well. The utter transparency and profound sincerity of Joan, commitment so unquestioning it borders on the frightening, versus in Lorna, uncertainty, opacity, so that the contrast is also between full acceptance of a commitment and the beginning of what will turn out to be a very dangerous withdrawal of the commitment. So I'll show you, if I could have my clips. I'll show you first, I mean, you've all seen this, but it's just wonderful to see it again. there is a scene in Lorna where a group of men are deciding her fate that I'm sure is a direct echo of this scene. But here is Lorna in what I'm sure is meant to be an echo.
Il leur a dit que j'avais une demi-heure à midi et que je pouvais revenir.
T'avais qu'à leur dire que tu pouvais être là que le soir.
Je lui ai dit, mais il ne comprenait rien. Il ne va pas bien, il va encore arrêter.
Pour toi au terminal 4, monsieur Ventura. Tu la prends, Fabio?
C'est bon, je la prends.
Il dit que cette fois-ci, il a su qu'il va arrêter. Il me demande de l'aider.
Il dit ça et demain il sera arrêté de défoncer.
Et si jamais il arrive à arrêter, qu'est-ce qu'on fait?
Mais comme prévu, on lui fait l'overdose.
Et la police va encore croire?
Évidemment qu'ils vont le croire. C'est pas la première fois qu'un camé qui arrête replonge et meurt d'overdose.
She also had never acted before. Didn't speak French either. And the fourth technique, as for the fourth technique, there's something we've already noted in passing. The related general issue of the representation of psychological states in all the films, and the son and Olivier in particular. Not only do we not very often simply see much of the face, when we do, as noted before, there is an almost unreadable, sometimes blank expression. There is a flicker of remorse and concern from Lorna in the scene we saw, but there is also a long scene, very long scene in a single take, where Lorna is, we think, trying to decide whether to defy her gang and try to divorce Claudie rather than kill him. She knows that she must show evidence of physical abuse to get that quick divorce that she needs, but there is a remarkable, thorough stillness in this scene of deliberation. We detect very little mental movement, if one can put it that way. We might say, at least nothing visible in her face. At its conclusion, which I'll show, she seems to have decided nothing, and then very suddenly she acts and we jump in our seats. At least we see no moment of deliberation or even preparation to act. There is almost a pure picture here of a deliberately isolated focus on the relation between inner deliberation and bodily movement, and it seems continuous and seamless, as if the bodily movement, itself rich in meaning, freighted with both self-punishment, self-sacrifice, and a strategic deed for the sake of a quick divorce, was going to happen next all along, as if the pacing and deliberating did not bear directly on the action, but was somehow part of the action. She simply sets her cups down, and then suddenly, this is what we see. I only have time to show a small part of the long take. It goes on silently like the beginning here for several minutes, and you have to imagine that. So much for the cinematic techniques and their relationship to conventional understanding of action and action explanation. Back to Olivier. Whatever else Olivier may want, revenge, closure, perhaps even another son. The movie for a long time was called The Father. And obviously there's some indication that the son the movie is about is not the dead son, but Francis as a kind of replacement son. Whatever else he wants, he also wants what we want. Understanding, to render something more intelligible. In this case, he clearly wants to understand how it is possible for an 11-year-old boy to have committed murder. He seems to realize in some abstract way that he should be having the same violent, passionate, desperate reaction of his ex-wife, simply on hearing the news that Francis had been released. He doesn't. And Olivier cannot tell the truth to his ex-wife, so he pretends that he has not taken him on as an apprentice. But after his initial moment of panic, it's clear that he can't bring himself to give up the chance to observe such a person close up, however painful it might be to constantly confront again and again what happened to his son. One can only imagine. He follows Francis furtively through town. He goes through his things. He slips into Francis's apartment, and in a moving scene even lies down on his bed, as if trying to inhabit his space, as if trying for a form of mimetic understanding. We are also thereby shown the striking similarity of Francis's and Olivier's apartment, cold, spare, empty of any signs of personality or comfort, degree 0 again. It's not the case, though, that even this much is clear to Olivier, or at least that there is much more to what he is doing than he can formulate. He gives his basic answer to this famous philosophical why question in a tense scene with his ex-wife, who has followed Olivier because she suspects he was lying and that he did in fact take on their son's murderer as an apprentice. Yet again, the cut ends before the scene does, and there is a jump cut before anything in the parking lot has ended. The genuineness of Olivier's answer in the scene, something I think relatively difficult for philosophers to accept as credible, is at the heart of what the film is attempting to work out. This is one of the most, if not the most important scenes in the film, so I'll show the whole thing.
Tu m'espionnes?
C'est lui?
Non.
Lâche-moi.
Calme-toi. Calme-toi.
Mais je veux qu'il me dise son nom.
Calme-toi. 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 C'est lui. Magali. Magali.
Vous l'êtes là, monsieur?
Ah, ça va, reste dans la voiture. Magali, ça va? C'est du café dans la voiture.
Qui tu te prends?
Tiens, bois.
Personne ne ferait ça.
Je sais.
Pourquoi tu le fais alors?
Je sais pas. T'habites où?
Rue du Molinet.
The breathing that you hear is, that's not just once, that happens a lot of times, and it's a kind of painful undercurrent reminder that his son was strangled. The breath was strangled out of him, and by contrast, he and the boy can breathe. Conventionally, we would normally say that what Olivier is trying to understand is what was inside Francis, especially what was he thinking and feeling, what was it like for him when he killed Olivier's son during a robbery gone bad. That, we think, is how we explain what people do, by reference to their purpose in doing it, to what they had in mind. Once we know that, we might go on to ask, whatever that internal makeup was, how it got to be that way, what brought it about. But given that answer to his wife, Olivier could just as well be said to be trying to find out why he is doing what he's doing just by doing it. More generally, however conventional and familiar, this way of understanding, access to the hidden inner of another, is denied us by the film, and the suggestion is that this is not uniquely true of Francis, that his psychological interior is just minimal or medicated away, but that this assumption about pure interiority is bound to lead us astray in all cases. At any rate, Olivier never finds out why Francis did what he did. He gets a chance to ask the question point blank, but the response is like most of the other psychological indicators in the film, flat, minimal. They are on a trip to Olivier's family's lumberyard so that Francis can learn the different kinds of wood. The preparation for this trip has been quite ominous, and there's a moment when Olivier stops the car suddenly and causes the sleeping Francis to hurl forward violently. Olivier at one point refuses to shake Francis's hand. There's a definite sense of possible violence in the air. So Olivier finally asks the decisive question, why did you kill? He clearly means, what made you think it was all right to kill someone for a car radio? But Francis assumes he's just asking for details and explains that he was surprised when there was someone in the car, that the son grabbed him and wouldn't let go, so he tried to break free by grabbing him by the throat and ended up strangling him. We see no remorse from Francis. On the contrary, a dogged, adolescent self-justification. The son was killed simply because he wouldn't let go. Remorse, we postulate, would require considerably more understanding of what he did and what the consequences were than Francis can muster up. Of course, he doesn't know who is interrogating him and why, but we don't get the sense that he understands much more of what happened to him and because of him than this. He barely remembers how old he was when he went to prison. And there's no real forgiveness from Olivier either, and no real way to understand what happened from Francis's point of view. There is barely a point of view there. We are again at something like psychology degree 0. And not just in the case of Francis. Olivier, as we saw, has no answer to his ex-wife's question either. He is ironically, and this is an irony that's throughout the film, in the same position as Francis. They both say, "Je ne sais pas." And the same camera technique, what we might call their refusal of the revelatory close-up, and the same minimalist psychological interiority is true of the treatment of the main characters, Igor in The Promise, Rosetta in Rosetta, Bruno in The Child, and both Olivier and Francis in The Son. Here's a brief montage of the two scenes in the car, my montage, not theirs. The violent stopping, and then the crucial question, why did you kill? As crucial as, why are you doing this to Olivier? Again, the two questions in parallel. You will see that in the end, Olivier is shown to go, in a sense, perhaps with this question, too far in what he expects of another human being. Literally, he drives by their turn. And to go back, for the first time in the film, he turns and faces us in the back seat, as it were, as if to face our expectations about what would be, could be, an adequate answer to either question in the face of there not being one.
Un lapin. Pourquoi est-ce que tu as tué? Tu me demandes d'être ton tuteur, j'ai le droit de savoir, non? C'est quoi que tu volais?
Une radio dans une voiture.
T'as tué pour une radio?
Il y avait un garçon derrière que j'avais pas vu. Il voulait pas me lâcher. Alors je l'ai attrapé par le cou jusqu'à ce qu'il lâche.
Tu l'as étranglé.
Il voulait pas me lâcher.
Tu l'as étranglé.
Je voulais pas. J'avais peur de me faire prendre.
Tu l'as quand même fait, sinon il serait pas mort.
Ouais, mais...
Ne dis pas oui, mais tu l'as fait, oui ou non?
Ah ouais.
Je suis dépassé.
But a qualification is, I'm almost done. A qualification is needed here. It's not quite right to say that Olivier has simply no idea of what he's doing with Francis. However, of the two things we are tempted to say about this mindedness, one is impossible and the other doesn't quite fit. Sometimes, colloquially, we want to say that someone had no reason for what he did. We want to say that he simply acted impulsively. But while this may be true of such things as getting up to pace around a room or drumming one's fingers on a table, these are exceptions that prove the rule. If it were strictly true that one could act in a directed way towards some end and not know why, what happened would have to fall outside the domain of action altogether and would have to be described as something happening to one, not done. Or we want to say, in the alternative that doesn't fit, he has a reason, but he doesn't know what it is. But Olivier clearly does not have a reason yet, even an unconscious one. This, I should say, in a way to admit an obvious question, this opens up a very large problem in the representation of subjectivity in modernist literature. For there are clearly other examples in modernist literature of the representation of a kind of flat or minimal subjectivity. Most of us remember from high school Meursault in Camus' novel The Stranger, or the chief character in Blanchot's L'Entretien Infini. And there's another kind of flat subjectivity of another sort in Kafka, at least in The Trial and in America. And there's the same sort of thing in Beckett. But here, there's not just a kind of absence. There's an absence that's felt as an anxiety, an absence that's also a kind of presence, not merely the kind of dialed down interior subjectivity you see in this other modernist context. What is more correct to say, what these films render credible, is that what we see is something like his reason in the process of being formed, and this not as the result of some train of deliberation and not fully available to him, but as noted throughout, in complex interchanges with others and the world. That is, I'm suggesting that notions like the unconscious, or self-deceit, or self-ignorance don't apply in Olivier's case. They're just other ways in which the standard model of ex-ante deliberation and intention is being invoked. What this possibility also opens up is that this process of interchange and formulation over time can be very different, depending on different social relations of power. There's obviously much more to say about these dimensions of realized agency, but in conclusion, I want to say that the Dardennes are in their own way quite sensitive to the importance of such a social context in trying to understand what people do, especially in conditions in which such agency, or let us say in general where the possibility of leading their own lives, is profoundly but not frontally threatened. In the other films, where the social conditions under which they live are quite prominent, something fundamental in even the characters' relation to themselves, their ability to understand and evaluate themselves, their even being conventional subjects for standard intentional explanation, is made an issue. The reflective, deliberative freedom that philosophers sometimes take as a model can be seen in such a world as another luxury, one made possible by leisure and the security these characters do not have, cannot ever expect to have. The consequence of not having it is on view in the films. We cannot easily, or even with difficulty, imagine what happens after the ending of a Dardenne film because the characters can't. This is not a sign of some flaw or absence in their character, some lack of sufficiently stable dispositions to project into the future, or it is that, but not merely that. It is, at bottom, an objective problem. So whatever stops Olivier from harming Francis when he has his hands around his neck at the end of the film is not something we are invited to tie to some conclusion he has reached or decision he has made, even though it is obviously not unrelated to how he feels, to what's going on in his mental life. As noted, perhaps finding himself doing to Francis what Francis did to his son gives Olivier some form of mimetic understanding. Deux fois, 2 times it happens, and that helps him. This indeterminacy is due to the fact that what he is doing in teaching Francis, whatever he is teaching him, is not complete. The event in the world that he is bringing about cannot be determinately specified. This is indicated again by the typical way the film ends so abruptly, without any natural fulfillment of their joint deed. As you'll see, their final scene of reconciliation is silent, played out simply in what they do, not in what they say or express, where what it is that Olivier is doing is not driven by any thought about what he ought to do, yet is not mindless or unintentional. Their joint action seems to suggest that they have silently found some way to wrap up or tie together, tentatively, what they have jointly achieved with respect to the past. It's also obviously of major importance to the filmmakers, and this is a mark of the difference between The Son and most of their other films, that that way involves meaningful work and non-alienated craftsman labor at that, the possibility of which is wholly absent in The Promise, Rosetta, The Child, and The Silence of Lorna. So here, next to the last clip, is a montage of the last scenes, the near strangling, and then the strange silent reconciliation at the end of the film. One more paragraph, I promise. By contrast, in the unrecognized and unacknowledged marginal characters in the other films, we see evidence of a kind of deep interiorization of the profound limitations of their social world, but not in a way that simply reduces them to victims of such objective conditions, and certainly not to objects. We return again to the moments of resistance mentioned earlier, but in the painfully limited, restrictive ways objectively possible in the world they inhabit. I mean such moments as one of the most pathos-filled in all their films, Rosetta, going to sleep at her friend's place, reflectively determining in a bravely hopeful way who she is and what she will do, but at a level of such minimality and simplicity that is painful to watch. As she falls asleep, she manifests in what she says a form of dissociation that we have seen is clearly no individual pathology. She is preparing to tell herself good night, assuming the role of the only recognizing other she can imagine in her world, herself. It's a fitting scene to end with, and this will be the last thing. Then I'll quit.
Tu t'appelles Rosetta. Je m'appelle Rosetta. Tu as trouvé un travail. J'ai trouvé un travail. Tu as trouvé un ami. J'ai trouvé un ami. Tu as une vie normale. J'ai une vie normale. Tu ne tomberas pas dans le trou. Je ne tomberai pas dans le trou. Bonne nuit. Bonne nuit.
Thank you for your attention. So long, Pippin.